All right, Yanni, take it away.
Okay, thank you to everyone. I wish I was there with you all, but hopefully I'll see you at JSM or other conferences. So today I'm talking about spatially coupled hidden Markov models for short-term forecasting of wind speeds. It's a bit more in progress than I would have hoped to by this point in the summer, but so I work in general with hidden Markov models. And so generally you have an observation that you're observing over time, or really in sequence, and you have some underlying state process that's governing the observation process. Typically, I work with discrete state hidden Markov models, so the states, in this case, discrete time finite state, are defined by the number of states, a transition probability matrix that describes the evolution of the state sequence over time, or in sequence. The state-dependent distributions, which can be really any valid distribution function, and I often use penalized splines distributions to do something a bit more semi-parametric and flexible. Because I work with ecologists often, I always have this sort of general interpretation, right? The number of patterns of interest, how we switch the state switching dynamics across these patterns, and so on. In a multivariate context, so if you have a multivariate response at each point in time, you can use multivariate hidden Markov models, often by assuming a joint distribution for the observation process, or doing contemporaneous conditional independence, where you have a joint distribution as a product of marginals. So why use a hidden Markov model? And generally, and from a marginal standpoint, hidden Markov model is just a dependent mixture model. So if you sort of remove the temporal component, you still have the sort of mixture components here. You have the gold state, the blue state, and the green state. And so really what changes from a finite mixture to this dependent mixture hidden Markov model is that you have now, when you have a few gold observations, you have a sequence of depending on your transition probability matrix, you have a few gold observations at a time. You can switch over to the blue. Once you switch over to the green, you have this persistence. You can have this persistence in the different states and observations observed over time. And again, I often work with ecologists applying to hidden Markov models. So this lends itself to an animal exhibiting a behavior, for example. The modeling error or wind speeds, people often use what's called Markov switching models rather than hidden Markov models. But really the only key difference is that in a Markov switching model, you are often formulating the state-dependent distribution as some autoregressive component or something that depends on previous observations and not just on the state itself. So when modeling wind speeds, you're often seeing regime switching, Markov switching, but I tend to sort of put them all into one same box. For me, it's just a hidden Markov model with different extensions. So this is actually something that came up during my postdoc. And it's something a bit out of my comfort zone because I was working with Brian Rich at NC State. And so we were looking at, getting a bit more into spatial statistics and spatial dynamics. He had thought about wind speed quite a bit. And so there's this Bonneville Power Administration data set that I know is often used, where you have different meteorological stations and you have different wind speeds associated with them. So for example, Tillamook, Hebo here on the left, there's different geographical regions as well. So there's like a mountain range, there's things by the coast, more inland and so on. And so when I was thinking about, doing the spatial modeling, spatial temporal modeling with wind, we have this wind speed, and perhaps we might want to forecast, especially for meteorological stations or stations with wind turbines, you might want to forecast, say, the next 24 hours, what that might look like. So I thought about combining spatial data and hidden Markov models just as a blend of our expertises. And what I generally saw is that we do have these sort of Markov switching spatial hidden Markov models, but you can assume that there's one spatial process that generates all the data at each point in time, or you take each location to be independent of each other in some way. And so we wanted to do is say, well, what if we don't assume that each process is governed by the same dynamics? So say we have like a green and a purple dynamic over space. And these 5 might be green at time t-1, and these 4 might be purple at time t-1, and so on. And we think that maybe if there's a lot of green or there's a lot of purple, the nodes that are adjacent to these greens and the purples might switch. Right? And so what we led to was thinking about coupled hidden Markov models. And coupled hidden Markov models are essentially you have multiple individual hidden Markov models where now the state processes interact over time. So in this case, a discrete time finite state coupled hidden Markov model are similarly defined by the number of states across the different locations of the different hidden Markov models that you're sort of blending together. You have a transition probability matrix, and now what changes is that this becomes time inhomogeneous, where what is occurring at location n at time t, the z sub t, depends not only at what occurred at the previous time point at that same location n, but it also depends on what was occurring at all other locations at time t-1, right? So now it's a function of not only the previous state, like a first order Markov chain, but also the previous state at every other location. And pretty much everything else stays the same. State dependent distributions, you can still have the sort of conditional independence given the state, and you can assume any valid distribution. Coupled hidden Markov models are I actually had seen them much more in the machine learning literature and activity recognition literature. For example, Brand 1996, this is where I first started seeing the papers that talked about coupled hidden Markov models. So there's this quantity of central interest, and there's been some work by recently by Du Schultz and Alex Schmidt at McGill, modeling spatio-temporal infectious disease spread of dengue. So working with aerial data and coupled hidden Markov models, which is actually, a fascinating paper. Jennifer Pohl, interacting behavioral dynamics between a dolphin mother and calf. They often use a smaller state space. And so essentially the spatially coupled hidden Markov models, what you have is you have different locations, and now the locations that are neighbors are going to affect each other over time. So the quantity of central interest is really how the state switching dynamics evolve over time. According to z sub t at location n depends on the state at time t-1 location n, but it also depends on what happened around its neighbors. So generally what I'm working on is doing this for more geospatial data. And Alex and her PhD student Dirk wrote a fabulous paper on coupled hidden Markov models for aerial data for the spatial temporal dynamics of dengue. So just sort of looking at the time, what I'm doing as well is doing sort of spatially coupled Markov switching process. So I'm just calling it a hidden Markov model. And I had a quick example, but you can essentially think about, setting up and what is, if you formulated the transition probability matrix in terms of sort of a spatial parameter, this psi equal to 1, how would you construct the matrix, right? What does that look like over time? And you can simulate some data. And so if you have a time series, location 33 in this grid, and you look at its neighbors, you can see what's occurring depending on the spatial parameter. So you can see how they might be interacting and influencing one another. You have in a 5x5 grid, you're also going to have, these edge cases that don't have as many neighbors. So I was quite interested to know, what's the impact of the sort of edge cases when you don't have that many neighbors? How do you evolve over time, and how does that change? So generally, we're trying to do the short-term forecasting. There's actually another fabulous paper fitting coupled hidden Markov models in the Journal of Computational Graphical Statistics a few years back. So I think maybe that's also bringing coupled hidden Markov models more into the statistical literature, showing that inference is possible even though you have this really large state space to explore. And so the scalable Bayesian inference for coupled hidden Markov models. And so you can update sequences of states one at a time. You have this block structures you can exploit as well. There's always computational challenges with hidden Markov models, but that's, I guess, part of the fun. And so when we want to do forecasting, generally we'll do the sort of Monte Carlo forecasting. In hidden Markov models, you actually always you can have a closed form solution, which is just at each point in time, this finite mixture model. This will also be the case in a coupled hidden Markov model. This just becomes a bit more complex to write in closed form. And so we have looked at, predicting if we have hourly wind speed data, predicting 24 hours in advance, and looking at how predictions, how well we can forecast future wind speeds. And so we'll do a few things, and we've done a few simulations with just hidden Markov models and so on. And so for me, what I generally am working on now is, in the Schultz paper, the authors work with aerial data, and they construct neighbors in their coupled hidden Markov model by the usual method of whether two districts share a border or not. And so the neighbors are a bit more defined. In our case, we have locations, so we have points on a map. So the idea will be to couple neighbors. Coupling neighbors in a coupled hidden Markov model does reduce the dimension of the underlying state space, because generally in coupled hidden Markov models, you assume that at time t, the state depends on everything that occurred at time t-1 at all of the possible locations and interactions. So in the spatial context, this provides a lot of a wealth of information. So one thing to do is do this sort of distance-based coupling, maybe using some a priori distance at which two locations cannot be neighbors. So after a certain distance, you say basically it's effectively zero. Possible weighting of locations closer to one another, incorporating other geographical information. So for example, in the Bonneville Power Administration data, you do have locations that are all mountain ranges. You have other locations that are closer to the coast. You have other locations that are inland. So distance alone may not really reflect a sort of dependent structure that we want to exploit. It could be dependence within sort of geographical regions of importance. And so the idea is that generally, when we were first started out working on this paper, we had the spatial dependence parameter that affected the transition quality matrix in a coupled hidden Markov model. And now what we might want to do is construct some distance metric, right? And it could be a nonlinear distance function, so it's not just decaying linearly over distance. We can have other functions that, after 500 meters or after 500 kilometers, it decays basically effectively to zero, but we still have to associate some type of distance. And we are working with, these, I think it was about 20 weather stations. And that sounds like it might be really difficult to do in a coupled hidden Markov model. And I think it can be tedious, but because we're really only going to be forecasting, when you use 2 weeks of locations at a time to forecast the next day, it actually doesn't seem too infeasible. So I think these models, coupled hidden Markov models, are quite practical, and they're showing up a bit more in the statistical literature, and I think it's a fun approach to exploit. So thank you.
Thank you, Gianni. That was really interesting. I've been curious about these models. Like I've been seeing them pop up, and I don't really know very much about them, but they seem very powerful. Just as you said, like maybe a little bit sort of more tedious to work with if you're not used to it at the scale. So is this the wind speed prediction for Bonneville is for allowing them to sort of forecast how much they're going to get from the wind turbines? Is that the connection there? Yeah,
that was generally the connection, but it was a bit more, I think, for me, doing hidden Markov models and trying to do something spatial with Brian. This is a bit outside my comfort zone, but I think it's a lot of fun, and I really love these models. I think there's a lot to exploit.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I want to know more. I've worked on some Bonneville data as part of the contract a long time ago, about 10 years, where we were trying to do structural forecasting of sun helioseismology stuff because of the current inductions on their long transmission lines. Yeah. And like they've got a lot of really interesting data.
They do.
They gave us some money to look at some of it. I don't know if they were happy with what we did, but we still got the chance to play, and that was fun. So
yeah, the Bonneville data.
Here, sorry. Yeah, Michael, I had a question.
Yeah, thanks for the great talk. Can you hear me okay?
I don't think so. No. Yeah, sorry. He's running across the room because it's hard to yell.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thanks for the great talk. So my question is, it seems like you have to apply a grid or some structure over the spatial field. in order to do this. Whereas maybe wind, you might think of it really as a continuous spatial process. So do you have any ideas about how to deal with that mismatch between, say, the measurement data would be at a point, so you're measuring the wind at a point, but you've really discretized your spatial space? Like, do you have any insights about, so for example, if you had two measurement stations in the same grid cell, they might measure something different, but in your model, would it be the case that necessarily they have the same wind because they're in the same grid cell? I guess my questions are around that change of point to grid and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's a great question. You don't have to grid. You could have individual locations, and that's actually not a problem at all. In Alex Schmidt's and her PhD student's paper, they do have aerial data, so it's, they have the sort of aerial structure already. But in this case, you don't need a grid at all. You can have two locations that are close to one another, and they evolve very differently. And I think part of the utility of Markov switching models is they're really flexible. You're not really incorporating a lot of really known dynamics of how the wind is going to be produced, but they're really, really flexible structures, and they can forecast short-term very well. And you can have two locations, two data sources right next to each other, and they evolve differently. And that wouldn't be a problem.
Great, thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, we're going to move to our next speaker, which, if I remember correctly, is in person. But everybody's staring at me as if I'm supposed to know, like I'm running this meeting or something.
No, not in person.
Very sorry, it's Anna. Hello, Anna.
I'm in Argentina, so.
Yeah, no, we're continuing with our second online, and then we have 3 people in a row in person. I'm sorry about that. So Ana Elias is joining us from Argentina. Thank you for joining us, Ana. Can you share?
Yes, can I begin sharing?
Yeah, please go ahead. You should be able to share.
Wait a minute. Just a minute. Here.
Okay, we can see your screen. We can see you. You're coming through good for audio.
And there you can see the screen, and it moves.
Everything's wonderful. So
Okay.
Ana, take it away.
Okay, I begin. Okay, good morning. I deeply appreciate the opportunity to participate in this meeting. I'm not used to participating in meetings which deals mainly with statistics, even though we use a lot of statistical methods. I will talk about filtering ionospheric parameters to detect long-term trends, a work done in collaboration with doctoral and postdoc students and other researchers of our lab in the University of Tucumán in Argentina. First, let's set the scene. I will focus on the F2 region of the ionosphere, and in particular in the ionospheric peak electron density that occurs in this layer measured through its critical frequency, FOF2. Very briefly, the ionosphere is the atmospheric region where there are free charges, electrons and ions, enough to affect electromagnetic radio wave propagation. It extends from around 60 kilometers up to the exosphere. And this charge density is produced mainly by solar ultraviolet and extreme ultraviolet radiation. And unlike the troposphere, it is a region highly sensitive to the solar variations. The Earth's ionosphere, in addition to its strong dependence on solar radiation, varies also with atmospheric conditions, like the greenhouse gases concentration, for example, with geomagnetic activity, with energetic particle flux, mainly, especially at high latitudes, and the geomagnetic field at high and low latitudes, all of which present variabilities in different timescales. Long-term trends have been of interest since the pioneering study in 1989 by Roble and Dickinson, suggesting that the long-term increase of greenhouse gases concentration that induce a global warming in the troposphere would produce a global cooling and shrinking of the upper atmosphere, which would affect the ionosphere. Even though anthropogenic forcing seems the main trend driver until now, there are also other trend forcings of natural origin, which are mentioned here. In particular, my main line of research is analyzing the effects of the Earth's magnetic field secular variation effects of the ionosphere, which are even smaller in most of the planet than the anthropogenic effect. I am not going to deepen into the physics of the subject, but to detect and quantify these trends, I need to be able to apply adequate and sensitive statistical techniques to practically detect a needle in a haystack. The motivation of this study arises precisely from considering that long-term trends in the F2 region parameters expected from anthropogenic or other effects are definitely much smaller than the amplitude of natural cyclic variations and noise, even than noise. So we need long data records and good statistical tools to unravel them. Two prominent variations in ionospheric parameters as FOF2, considering, for example, a fixed hour, are the seasonal and the solar activity variation. To begin, we have here the 12-month running mean of FOF2, which is the black curve, and the 12-month running mean of the sunspot number used as a solar activity proxy. And from here, we can see that the relationship is almost linear. In fact, the sunspot number explains more than 95% of FOF2 variability. As an example, in order to have some ideas of magnitude, here is a table. We have some amplitude variation of FOF2 for the station of Wakanai, that is a mid-latitude station. I only wanted to see that the trend, the relative magnitude in percentage with respect to the natural variabilities, do not reach even 5%. So it is really, really small. Due to this, prior to trend estimation, we have to filter them. As a first step, the seasonal variation present in FOF2, but not in solar activity proxies, is filtered out applying a 12-month running mean to both FOF2 and the solar proxy. And another possibility is to consider the annual time series or to consider each month separately. We do this kind of analysis. The next step, which is here, is to filter out solar activity. One option is to apply an 11-year running mean to the time series, in which case the series are shortened in 11 years. Since ionospheric time series are relatively short, this is not always a convenient procedure. Another option is to estimate FOF2 residuals from the regression between the experimental values and the solar activity index, such as the sunspot number in the figure that I showed you previously, where A and B are constant, which can be determined with the least square. And finally, the trend is estimated from a linear regression of the residuals with time, which would be years, for example, if we use the annual time series. As can be noticed from all this, the trend alpha in this case will depend on the steps previous to its calculation, and especially on the filtering process applied to the series involved. There are in general several filtering processes. We will focus particularly in the FOF2 case in just 5 of them, which I will explain you now, which is the saturation effect, the hysteresis effect, the nonlinearity of the model, the choice of the model or of the solar activity index to assess the trends, and the length of the period considered. Let's begin with the saturation effect. Saturation takes place in the case of some ionospheric stations when solar activity level exceeds certain value. For example, here we see that the relationship is linear until more or less 160 in the sunspot number. But after 160, the ionosphere seems not to respond linearly to the increase in the solar activity. If we estimate the residuals as usual, this situation results in persistent negative residuals here. So depending on where these residuals are in your time series, you will obtain a trend that it is not real. It's just due to the filtering you have done. In particular, these years of saturation occur at the beginning of most of the ionospheric time series, which begin around 1950, 1960. So we have persistent negative residuals in here. So you obtain just due to it's like a spurious effect, as we call it, a positive trend, which in fact it's not here, it's not real. Or for example, if you are you have the negative trend expected from anthropogenic effect, but this will make your trend to be less negative or null, for example. This is the example for Sodaki. There's a possibility to solve this is to exclude the periods with UV above the saturation level and problem solve. That would be a very easy way to solve this problem. But you have to be aware of it in order to be able to take some actions. The other problem with filtering is the hysteresis effect, which refers to the fact that for the same value of solar activity level, FOF2 may differ for the rising and falling part of the quasi-decadal solar cycle. The variation of FOF2 then over a complete solar cycle displays a curve similar to the hysteresis variation of a magnetization cycle. This phenomenon is attributed to the behavior of geomagnetic activity throughout the solar cycle, which I am not going to deepen into this because I will not have time. This figure shows FOF2 for stations low in terms of the sunspot number, and in each color gives a different solar cycle, and you can see clearly the hysteresis. If a time series presenting hysteresis is filtered using the traditional method we all use, this results in spurious trends. And here I show you like a statistical experiment where we have an artificial hysteresis. This is the method. You apply a linear regression to make the filtering, so the residuals will result in a curve like this. And if you estimate the trend, you will have a positive trend, which in fact doesn't exist. It appears because the way you filter the series and the physical phenomenon behind it. A problem to solve this is to have more than one cycle. Here I have made the illusion of having several solar cycles. We don't have more than 5, in fact. And the trend due to this begin to disappear. And let's move now to nonlinearity, nonlinearity problem. The possibility that the factor responsible for trend in the ionosphere, whichever it may be, does not act with the same intensity along the solar cycle, it will be a problem for us. In fact, some papers have shown that there is a solar cycle dependence of the thermosphere response to the radiative cooling of the greenhouse gases. And an example is here. A solution would be, well, just use maximum or minimum levels. So here is an example with the trend estimated with all the years. And here we have just the maximum and just the minimum, and we obtain different trends. Of course, in this case, for this station, the difference is not statistically significant, but we should keep in mind that there are other stations, other latitude regions, and with other cycles that it could appear this problem. Now let's move to the EUV proxy choice. In order to filter the effect of the EUV solar radiation, which I remind you that is the dominant effect in the ionosphere, we use proxies. Since we do not have measurements of the spectral EUV range responsible for the ionization of the ionosphere, that is why we use proxies. There are several which are used for this purpose. Here I mentioned 6, and each one is originating in a different region of the solar atmosphere. For example, sunspot number in the photosphere, magnesium-2 in the high chromosphere, Lyman alpha in the transition region of the sun, F10.7 high in the chromosphere and solar corona, F30 high chromosphere and corona, and helium-2, which is also used in the transition region of the sun. All of them, when you look at the annual time series or the monthly time series, correlate very well. Here you have a table with the correlation coefficients. But when you use them to filter the solar activity and then estimate the trend in ionospheric stations, here I have an example of 9 ionospheric stations. I have estimated the trends for each month, for the time series of each month, covering the period 1960-2022, which is almost 5 or 6 solar cycles. The solar cycle is not exactly 10 years, it's between 10 and 12. Each color is for each proxy. And we can clearly see that they are not equal in all the cases. You can think, well, the difference is very small. Yes, but the trend we're looking for is very small. So this difference matters to us. Here, where am I? Here, yes. Now let's go to the last problem I want to explain you, and is the length of the period considered is related to the stability of the trend value in terms of the time series length. In general, if the trend forcing is stable and do not interact with other variability sources, one expects that that as the time series length increase, and assuming a background that is constant along time, which is not true either, the detected trend will be closer to the real value and will converge slowly to it. That is what we are expecting. These figures show FOF2 and trend estimation, first for the period 1960-1980, which is this trend. The time series begin always in 1960. Here we increase 1 year at a time, and we see further the trend seems to converge to the negative trend we are expecting from the greenhouse gases effect. But as soon as we begin to incorporate years after 2000, the trend becomes more positive. However, here we have a physical explanation. Something strange happened. Some strange things happen with the proxies, and 2008 and 2019 have been very special minimum solar activity levels, which are below any minimum previous to them. So, well, there is a mix of statistical method and physical causes. Here is an explanation. Also, because we had a very special maximum here, and there was a problem with the proxies. Here, just to show you, we have done this experiment with monthly series for different local times, not just for noon. And well, we see that the ideal thing would be to see stripes in the same color here, and it's not the case. Okay, as a summary, and I don't know how am I with the time, but some facts to consider is that the effects of trend sourcing, like increasing greenhouse gases concentration, Earth's magnetic field, secular variation, and others, may not be constant along the solar activity cycle, so they may arise some problems. The filtering procedures normally apply to ionospheric parameters, may not be 100% correct or effective. The index used do not show all the variation in the solar UV radiation that is responsible for FOF2. So we should revise the models underlying the filtering process prior to trend estimation. And well, why it's important to do a correct filtering of ionospheric or atmosphere in general parameters. We live in the Earth and we want to understand and predict the atmosphere, which is essential for human life. One of climate science main focus is to determine the extent to which humans are altering the planetary energy balance through the emission of greenhouse gases and pollutants. This anthropogenic effect is so small that all other variabilities must be filtered out first. That's why filtering is so important for us. This happens in every layer of the atmosphere, even in the troposphere, and bad filtering ends in bad results and incorrect identification of trend sources. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for your talk. That was really interesting. I've used the 10.7 flux in some previous projects and worked actually with the researchers at the Penticton DRAO in Canada, who are one of the primary 10.7 instruments that actually observe that data. So it's interesting to see it coming in as an input into some other model. And I know that
we use it very much. Yeah. In fact, it was the solar activity proxy recommended to assess trends, but now that we have long data enough, we now recommend magnesium 2 and F30.
Good to know. Well, we have to jump on to our next speaker. So thank you very much again. I'm glad you could join us today. We're going to pass off to Keelan McHugh, who's here in person, and he's going to be talking about something a little bit different. And we're still talking about air and atmosphere and things that are above the ground, but he's more interested in deposition.
Is there a clicker, or will I just use
there is. I can grab it for you. You can get your slides up.
Sorry.
Yes. Just to make sure we're loaded and connected and shared. Full screen. Share screen. Good. Let's just try to make also go, and you should be able to click ahead.
Great.
Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Keelan. I'm a PhD student in University College Dublin in Ireland. And as part of an EPA-funded project, I'm looking at tropospheric ozone in Ireland. But I've been in Trent here in Professor Julian Ahern's lab. And today I'll be talking about one of my thesis chapters, which is a land use regression analysis of tropospheric ozone in Ireland. Could I just actually get it out of a matter of interest, show of hands, how many people have heard of tropospheric ozone? Okay, a few have. Okay, I thought there might be a few more, but well, everyone will have heard of the ozone layer in the stratosphere, which is located between 10 and 50 kilometers above the Earth's surface, and this is vital for life on Earth. We wouldn't be here without it. It absorbs harmful UV radiation, but this same gas, when it's at ground level, it's quite a powerful oxidant and can have quite negative implications for living organisms that it comes into contact with. In humans, it irritates our respiratory tract, and studies have shown an increase in asthma attacks on days when ozone concentrations are high. In plants, it enters through the leaf stomata on the undersurface of the leaf and damages the upper leaf surface. And of course, this reduces photosynthesis, you can see in the picture, and overall growth and health of the plant, and it'll reduce yields in crops, for example. Ozone is considered to be a secondary pollutant, which just means that it's not emitted directly itself. It's formed from a reaction of other compounds, which are called precursors. There's many precursors, but for the purpose of this, and the two most common are NOx, which refers to nitrogen dioxide, and nitrogen oxide. Has sources mainly the combustion of fossil fuel is the main human source. Natural sources of things like soil and even lightning strikes are a source of NOx. So this reacts with volatile organic compounds. Again, there's many sources of these, things like solvents and adhesives, like cleaning products. Vegetation also emit VOCs. So these react photochemically, so it requires heat and sun, and ozone is formed. Now, of course, this is a real oversimplification, and as we know, once you step outside, it's way more complex than it is on paper. And the ratio of these precursors is quite important. If you have a balanced ratio, you'll have a lot of formation, a lot of ozone formed. If the ratio is skewed, just take a city, for example, where you have a lot of cars, a lot of emissions of NOx, this ratio is skewed, and it actually leads to the overall destruction of ozone. So highlighting the complex nature. And then oftentimes just downwind of a city, you'll have higher ozone concentrations because this ratio becomes more balanced. So yeah, we know how ozone concentrations vary because we can measure ozone. There's a couple of ways we can measure at ground level. First is active measurement. It requires a power source. It's expensive, but will give you hourly values, and it's quite precise. The other option is a cheaper option, doesn't require power. It involves putting out passive diffusion tubes. The only downside is these give you only an average value of your deployment time, which is usually between 2 and 4 weeks. Ireland is located on the western Atlantic edge of Europe, experiences a cool temperate climate. Concentrations are kind of what you'd expect for that part of Europe. There's higher concentrations in the Mediterranean area, where it's warmer, and lower concentrations in the Nordic countries. Then, having said that, there is a limited number of stations measuring ozone, and some of these are clustered in cities and urban areas. So as you can see in the map, there are large areas of rural landscape which is around the center, that we don't really know what concentrations are experienced there. So what can we do about that? Well, land use regression could come in handy here. It attempts to develop a relationship between the observed ozone at site and the local land use characteristics. So the sources of precursors that are leading to ozone formation, or the sinks are the removal processes, like surfaces it's deposited onto, or reactions with other gases. So it's using geospatial data to make a predictive model, and it's useful when monitoring data is not available. So this will hopefully allow us to make finer scale maps. So the objective of this study was to improve our knowledge of how ozone varies in Ireland. This is carried out by increasing the spatial coverage of ozone sampling with passive samplers and using a land use regression analysis approach. So firstly, increasing the spatial coverage. It was 14 active sites. We added an additional 20, which were evenly spaced in between these. Sites were selected using a spatial coverage function in R. So at each location, we deployed samplers for 4 weeks, 3 times for June, July, and August in summer 2022. We used triplicate samples to test the quality of the samplers, and we co-exposed at 3 active monitoring sites so that we could calibrate the passive data based on the active data. So we have data for 34 sites across Ireland for the summer 2022. So the next step was to develop a relationship with the local characteristics, these sources and sinks. So what is influencing these concentrations that were measured? These are the predictor variables. So this is the list of predictive variables that were used. You can see we've things like building area, land use, elevation, weather, distance to coast, distance to major road, distance to an integrated pollution control facility. These are just EPA facilities that are known to emit pollutants and that have controls on them. Modeled precursors, population. So basically anything that could influence the ozone concentration, we tried to include in the list. We then ran at different buffer sizes. So buffer size was essentially a radius of a circle that we drew around each sample point. You can see in the example, I don't have a laser here, but yeah, the example here in the middle is the red point in the middle was the sample site, and this is a 300-meter buffer around it. So we ran buffers between 100 meters and 5 kilometers. And you can see in the example that I have here, we have some building areas. There'll be a value for building areas, forest, woodland, scrub, total road length. So each of the 34 sample sites, we have a value for each of these predictive variables and at different buffer sizes. I then ran a principal component analysis to identify the most important variables. We did a correlation test to avoid multi-collinearity within the model. Data was log transformed, and then using all possible regressions, we did stepwise forward, where you start with no predictive variables, you add one at a time, and stepwise backward, you start with them all, remove one at a time, with the aim of maximizing the percentage of explained variance at R squared. So the predictive variables were included in the model if they raised the R squared value sufficiently. If they had no effect or they reduced it, we left them out of the model. And the final model was chosen based or taking the adjusted AIC value into account, which was just a measure of how well the model fits the data that it was built from. So some results, you can see from the 34 sites, August had the highest concentrations measured. And the model was able to explain 68% of the explained variance, adjusted R squared of 0.63, which is okay. It's kind of similar to some other ozone studies. So what predictive variables did we have? These were the 5 that were chosen by the model. So we've distance to coast, distance to these integrated pollution control facility, annual rainfall, forest area within a 500-meter buffer, and water area within a 1,000-meter buffer. So what do these mean? Well, distance to coast, from the model, we can say that the closer to the coast you were, the higher ozone concentration you would expect to experience. And this is, we did expect this because coastal areas generally have higher ozone. We get a lot of rain in Ireland. It rains all the time, so we have a lot of cloud cover. Coastal areas have less cloud cover, so they have more direct sunlight and more photochemical creation of ozone. Also, it's a flatter surface. Usually in coastal areas, you don't have forests and stuff like that, so you have less deposition in these areas. Distance to an IPC facility, going the model, we can say that the closer you are to an IPC facility, the less ozone there would be. The further away, the more ozone. Again, we would expect this because these facilities were generally located in urban or industrialized areas. And as I mentioned at the start, the ratio of these precursors is skewed in these areas. So the further away you are, the higher ozone we would expect. Again, so we did expect that. A forest area within a 500-meter buffer, this would come down to deposition and the rate of deposition. If you can imagine a flat field versus a forest or a woodland scrub area, there's a lot more surface area when you have the trees there. So you have more deposition onto these surfaces. And also when you have trees, it will reduce the temperature, so you have less creation of ozone in the first place. I just mapped a small bit of it. I was hoping to have some more of this done, but putting the equation in on a 1 by 1 kilometer grid we can see that it does give us an indication of the areas that will likely be higher in ozone concentrations and the areas that will be lower. Yes, just some limitations. Again, the temporal resolution, the passive samplers would be a limitation. We know ozone follows cycles, and the passive sampler will just give you an average value. The location limitation, while the spatial coverage function did give us exact points, we were limited to telephone poles that we could safely access from the road. And Northern Ireland predictive variables, unfortunately, we won't be able to map Northern Ireland because some of the predictive variables just weren't available in the same form there. So I think the takeaway point would be the rate of deposition and the distance to an IPC facility, or basically an NO2 source, would be key in determining the ozone experienced at a given location. So thank you, and if you have any questions or recommendations, I'll try and answer them. Every time.
We're doing great. So you've got these local source pieces and you're using them to help build the land use. How many of those local sources did you place?
Predictive variables.
Well, no, not predictive variables. You actually,
sorry.
the telephone poles.
Oh,
How
yeah.
many of those did you actually
Deploy.
Yeah.
We 20 locations. There's a lot of them. Yeah. We 20 locations, did that 3 times. Yeah.
Okay, so 60 of those.
Yes.
And so all of the other locations across where you're trying to use the land use, you calibrated your model to the areas where you had data. And then you're trying to use those predictive variables to predict.
Yeah.
Did you do any calibration of those predictions? Like you do some full blind predictions, you haven't seen any data from those locations?
No. Yeah. No, not yet. No.
Okay.
Yeah. But I think that would be something useful to do. Yeah.
You now have a model.
Yeah, we do.
Yeah. Predictions. So it's time to go to those some locations and see if those predictions.
I think that would be the good next step. I think. Yeah. I think we'll make a move on that. That would be good.
And actually, at this meeting, you're surrounded by people who could probably help you take those land use localizations and smooth the field.
Okay.
Which may actually just give you continuous coverage.
Okay, great. Yeah. I think so. Yeah.
And do you have a question too?
I just wonder, you showed one of the leads of the plan that manifests the ozone.
Yep.
Can you use this as an auxiliary variable for helping you detect if an area is a little bit bad or whatever it is, and the distribution of these plants within the island?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, you could use damage on the leaf. You would need to get out and survey, and it can be quite difficult to tell if ozone has damage because it doesn't leave any residue behind. You can't take a cut, so you have to. Really need to train eye. Like I've been studying for a few years, and it is still quite difficult. Usually, you can tell it's ozone damage because it'll only be on the upper leaf surface, and it'll be in between the veins. So it would, I probably could have, but it would have been difficult to get out and to get a full survey of the country.
When you, for example, the list of covariance that you have shown, it's a very extensive list. If one can collect these things and put them as one covariance.
Yeah, it would have been good.
I just was looking at the post and about finding some way of getting some measurements here.
Yeah.
That is not.
I think that would be a benefit definitely if we had extra data like that to add into it. That would build a picture of the ozone formation and sources and things would have been useful. All right, yeah.
Thank you, Julie. So next up, we have Kayla Wilkins, another local. She's here in person. Her slides are already up. She's going to come into camera view, and we'll hand it over to her.
Okay, all right. So first I'll introduce myself. I'm Kayla Wilkins, and I'm currently a PhD candidate here at Trump University in the Environmental and Life Sciences program. So first and foremost, I'm an environmental scientist, but there are lots of days that I really wish I had been a statistician first, because obviously we use statistics in environmental science all the time. So I'm really thrilled to be part of this conference where we bring those two disciplines together. I'll be presenting on behalf of my co-authors, Tobias Roth, Julian Ahern, my supervisor, and Roland Bobick. And on my last slide, I'll put the reference to where this work is published in case anybody wants to check it out further. I'm going to be talking about a comparison that we did about different change point tools that are looking at environmental change points across environmental gradients. And I'll do that in the context of nitrogen critical loads. If you don't know what any of those things are, don't worry, I'll explain them as I go. Okay, so I have 3 key pieces of background information before I start into our study. The first is that elevated atmospheric nitrogen deposition is thought to be one of the key drivers of biodiversity loss globally. And so these nitrogen compounds are the ones that are emitted from things like burning fossil fuels or agricultural emissions. They get up into the air, they come back down. Okay, so that's our pollutant, and it has an environmental impact. Of course, there are many, many ways that you can look at the relationship between an environmental pollutant like nitrogen deposition and its impact on the environment. But if you notice something in your science, like nitrogen deposition is leading to biodiversity loss, and you want to do something to rectify that, like maybe reduce the emissions, you need to bring policymakers into the discussion. So this leads me to my next piece of background information, these critical loads. So they're essentially an effects-based tool that identifies harmful effects to the environment. What critical loads do, their function, is to take all that science that connects nitrogen deposition to a reduction in biodiversity, and it distills it down into one number or a narrow range of numbers. So now, instead of taking a stack of science papers and giving it to our policymakers, we can give them one report. And apparently they like that. So that connects those pieces. One of the ways that we can draw that relationship between our nitrogen deposition and our biodiversity loss is to look at how species are changing across the gradient. So you can picture a map, and on our map, we might have areas with low deposition, areas with high deposition, and then a bunch in between. So this is our gradient, and then we want to pick plots that cover those low, medium, and high areas, and we essentially count the number of species or which species are at those plots. So this is our species abundance data. My table at the bottom, totally fictional data, but I'm just highlighting how that kind of works. We have 2 plots. We have 4 species identified at those plots, and we'll count how many occurrences of those species are there. Or we can also look at what % of the plot they cover. I'm going to call that our raw species data, where we've counted it. You can do things like summarize the data with a summary statistic like species richness, which essentially you're just saying how many species are there. So it kind of takes a snapshot of the total data set. The reason I'm explaining this is because the models that we compare, some use this raw species data as an input, and some use a summary statistic like species richness. Okay, so across this gradient, we're going to look and see where those species are changing or where the species richness is changing. And if we can identify a point where that changes abruptly, we're calling this our change point. Where does the greatest change occur? Okay, and this leads us into our study. In our critical load work, we noticed that there were a bunch of different change point tools used to inform critical loads. So in other words, there's a lot of different statistical methods that can identify an environmental change point. So we saw that. What we didn't know was how the results of those statistical tools compared. So we didn't know if we were comparing Granny Smith to Empire apples or if we were comparing apples to oranges. There is a very straightforward solution to answer our question. We would just take the same data set and run it through all of those models to see what would happen. So that's what we did. We selected 4 change point models that we had observed were used in critical load work or to inform critical loads. And then we selected 2 data sets and we ran those data sets through the models. So we had species abundance from mountain hay meadows in Switzerland. That's my top picture. And from Atlantic oak woodlands in Ireland, my bottom picture. In addition, we are interested to see, do we need to include all our species? So what does the change point look like if we look at all the species? Compared to what if we just pull out a subset of species and we just run those? Do we get the same change point for less work, or do we get a different change point? What does that do? So for the next few slides, I'm going to very briefly describe the 4 statistical tools we use to identify our change points. The first is a visual inspection of change point categories, just visual inspection. You first bin your nitrogen deposition gradient into equal size classes, and then you find the mean and the confidence interval of your biodiversity measure, so your species richness, for each bin. And then visually by eye, you look and say, where do we see the first significant difference between our biodiversity measures along the gradient? In my generic example here, it would be between the 10 and 15 and the 15 and 20 bin. Because we've binned here, we just take the midpoint between the bins. That's our change point. Our second method in our paper, we called the point at which significant change can be observed, which is very long. So I'm just going to refer to it as the CAPE method. That's the last name of the author on the paper where we pulled this technique from. You're using a generalized linear model to describe the relationship between your environmental gradient and your response measure or your biodiversity measure. You plot the fitted line and the confidence intervals, and then you look for the first observation along the environmental gradient, and you assume that this point on the gradient is your background amount. So this is our background. And then you look for the first point on the line, a fitted line that's significantly different or outside the confidence intervals from that first background point. Third model, again, we used a generalized linear model. And but we did a broken stick analysis. So this is also called a segmented or piecewise analysis. You're essentially plotting the relationship between the environmental gradient and your biodiversity measure, but you're plotting 2 lines of best fit where the slopes of those lines meet or where the stick breaks. This is what we identify as our change point. Our last model, the 4th one. I left this one to last because it's probably the least familiar. And I'm going to go over it briefly, but I think it's a really neat one. So if anybody wants to talk to me about this one after, I'm more than happy to do so. This is threshold indicator taxa analysis, or TITAN. This one is different from the other models because instead of using a summary statistic, it looks at all of the abundance data, and it does 3 things. First, the model determines if each species is increasing or decreasing along the gradient, separates those into 2 groups. Second, for each species, it uses a non-parametric partitioning method to determine where that species most abruptly changes its abundance along the gradient. So this is our species level change point. In our critical load work, we're not that interested in what an individual species is doing. We want to know what the whole community is doing or how that whole habitat is reacting. So TITAN does the 3rd thing, and this is the part we're really interested in. TITAN looks at all those individual species change points. It does this separately for the decreasing species that are shown in black and the increasing species shown in red. And it looks for the point along the gradient where the individual change points cluster. or aggregate, and it identifies a community level change point from that information. So that's the one we're interested in for our critical load work. And we're particularly interested in the decreasing community change point so that we can compare it to the decreasing species richness for our other models. I just put this on the slide so you can see what our results would look like. We have, for each of our 4 input data sets, we have the output from the 4 models. We present them graphically. However, I have summarized the change points from all of those graphics into a table. Okay, so on my table, the rows show the results for each of the different 4 methods, and the column headings tell you which data set we ran through that method. So remember I said I took subsets of each of our 2 main data sets. So for our mountain hay meadows, we ran all species. Then it was a non-random subset. We picked out oligotrophic species, or those are ones that are sensitive or require low levels of nitrogen. Then we ran all of our oak woodlands data. And then again, we picked a non-random subset. And this time we picked positive indicators or species that are known to be characteristic of that habitat. You can look at this table and get information from it 2 different ways. You can look down the columns, and that will tell you what the change points are for each model for a given data set. So for example, for our mountain hay meadows all species, the visual inspection gave us a change point of 12.5, the Cape method 21.6, so there's quite a big jump. Broken stick 11.3 and Titan 12.8. So Titan and visual inspection gave us almost the same result. Broken stick quite similar and Cape quite different. If we look at our all species column for the Atlantic oak woodlands, you'll see a little bit more variation in the change points. But again, visual inspection and Titan were quite similar, 10 and 13. The Cape method this time was our lowest estimated change point, and broken stick was between them. The other way you can use this table is to compare for each method how they handled the all species data set versus the subset. For visual inspection and Titan, they were nearly identical in each time we ran them. So those were very similar. And for broken stick, they were quite similar for the mountain hay meadow data set and a little bit more different between the Atlantic oak woodland set and subset. And Cape method, especially for the mountain hay meadows, very big difference between our all species data set and subset. So just to summarize the results, the visual inspection, broken stick, and Titan generally produced change points that were similar to each other. Visual inspection and Titan produced change points for the all species versus the subset. They were very similar. So we think they just might be less influenced by the number of species that we run through them. Titan had been criticized because sometimes the individual species change points were a bit unrealistic compared to what we expected them to be. But through this work, we also found that that didn't appear to affect the community level change point, which was good news because the community level one is the one we really care about for our critical load work. So, final conclusion, we felt confident that the estimates of the change points were comparable between visual inspection, broken stick, and Titan. And so the results of those studies could be used in the future to inform critical loads. So this is, of course, important information to pass on to our critical load community for other researchers doing gradient work to help them choose which models to use. And perhaps it's useful for other fields as well. So thank you very much. And I would be happy to take any questions if we have time. And I'll share these slides. So I have references for our model comparison and then each of the models that we used.
Thanks for that. That's awesome. So, do any of the methods that you tried report the uncertainty in the estimate of the change point? Because that's
Yes.
a really important. I mean, for example,
Yes,
the
it is.
case method is giving these wildly different ones, but it might not be. You might think of that differently if it said, yeah, but I'm really not sure where this change point is.
Right.
Um,
That's a really good question. So this is just another example. The Titan model that is the second one in, that's one of the advantages. And our study, it does list the advantages and shortcomings for each model, which I didn't have time to cover. And the linear model with the change point does that as well. So 2 of the 4 models did. Something to note that may be part of the reason that the CAPE model is so different here. It really does depend on those confidence intervals. And think about when you change a sample size, the sample size changes the confidence intervals. And so depending on your sample size, you're getting a lot of fluctuation there. So we think that could be contributing to that big difference, but it doesn't actually give you an estimate of confidence around the change point.
I think that probably would have enough data to actually attempt to get confidence limits for the position of the change rate.
Okay.
And I think this distribution is a little bit more complicated in this statistical sense.
Okay.
And there is a difference between estimating the change point and detecting a change. You see, you are detecting a change as a precursor to try to identify the change point.
Okay.
So this is, I just want to put these things in. One method that might be quite good to consider, which is might not be might not have thought, is the cumulative sum. You see, you get a regression line like what you did like this. You compute the residual, and then you take the forward cumulative sum of the residuals.
Okay.
And the backward cumulative sum of the residuals. So you start at one end and going forward, and you start at the end, other end, and you start backward. And then when you get the point of intersection between those two, will give you an estimate of the thing that you want. But this is just
No, that's very helpful. Thank you. Now we want to continue this, and it is good to get the statisticians to give some input here.
Oh, I was just at the ISI World Statistics Conference, and there were 4 different sessions with 12 different talks on cutting edge change point methods.
Okay.
And obviously, it takes a while for them to filter down to ecology,
Yes.
but it does exist. It's just, as Michael suggested, like, you don't have a lot of data.
Yeah.
So there's not a lot to work with to try and detect. As I said, what the point is, that's probably a pipe dream. Where it falls is more reasonable.
Yeah.
So there's one last question I wanted to show you, just from Christy, who's online today. She was asking about your thoughts on the relevance for landscape genomics.
I would say that I don't have any thoughts on from the top of my head, but I'm sure that those 2 things can be combined and that we could gain some perspective from that as well. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much.
Thank
Kayla.
you.
We have one last talk in this session, which is a visitor, but he's here in person, which is great. Let's just make sure you're online, sir. All right.
Great. So thanks, Wes. So for those I haven't managed to meet yet, I'm Michael, and I'm from the University of Wollongong, and I'm going to talk about our project on. I'll just stand.
You're a lot taller than.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Oh, sorry. On inferring changes to the global carbon cycle with the Wombat, a system we made, which is a flux inversion framework, and I'll explain what that is. So I'll start off by saying that this work involved a lot of different people. There were 3 statisticians, including myself. We had 4 atmospheric scientists and also an IT specialist. And as you'll see, you kind of need all of these people to do what we did. So let's motivate. So we all know that CO2 is the leading greenhouse gas that drives climate change, and the emissions of CO2 by humans are the reason. It's increasing the atmospheric concentration. What not everyone knows is that around half of the CO2 that we emit gets reabsorbed or gets absorbed by the land and the ocean, which is a very good thing, because otherwise the atmospheric concentration would have increased by twice as much. So it'd be much more global warming. But something about this is that this actually constitutes a really large change in the carbon cycle, because before the fossil fuel era, these absorptions weren't happening. And so that's one change. And there are lots of other changes that have been documented, like shifting growing seasons of different ecosystems and so on. So our goal in this project was to infer changes to the global carbon cycle, but specifically 2 things. So to infer when and where CO2 is exchanged between the surface and the atmosphere. So we're talking about these exchanges between the surface and the atmosphere, and then to infer when and where and how these processes are changing. So what locations are changing most, and so on. So that's the goal. I'll talk more about it. But I'll give a bit of a rough and ready carbon cycle overview. And I'm a statistician, so maybe an atmospheric scientist or a carbon cycle scientist would be upset with what I say, but I'll just do it. So here's a picture I got from NOAA, and it's a really complicated diagram of the carbon cycle. And don't look too closely. You just see lots of arrows. Things move around. They move within the atmosphere, between the atmosphere and the land, between the atmosphere and the ocean, within the ocean. Things flow down rivers. There's just so much that goes on. So I've made a simplified diagram that pertains to what we looked at, how we viewed it in our exercise. So first off, you have all these physical processes along the bottom, and these are kind of the 5 most important: wildfires, photosynthesis, plant respiration, the ocean broadly, and fossil fuel usage, essentially. And these can be either sources and sinks of CO2, and the broad term for that is a flux of CO2 to the atmosphere. And up in the atmosphere, once you emit CO2, it doesn't just stay put, it moves around with the wind. So, and that process is called transport. And so we need to grapple with both of these things. But our target is the flux, okay? So how much CO2 is being emitted and absorbed. And you can imagine adding up the flux from all the different sources and sinks at a particular location, and that gives you flux. And that's a space-time field. We call it X. It's kind of the target of our study. And I've just shown a time average, just a spatial picture. So this is a 6-year average of a plausible estimate of what the flux could be at any given location. So brown means it's going from the surface to the air, and then green or blue, however you perceive that, means it's going from the air to the surface on average. And so you can see big fossil fuel emitting regions in the Northern Hemisphere, where there's lots of people, like over China and the United States, and there are regions like in South America that absorb CO2. But that's a spatial structure, but there's actually a really rich time series structure that goes on too in this field. So I've zoomed in on a grid cell, which happens to just be conveniently placed to put this plot next to it. At the top, I've got a time series of plausible estimates in this grid cell. Okay, and I've at a monthly scale, and I've split out the fossil fuel and the natural fluxes at this location. There's no ocean here, so there's no ocean fluxes. And the natural fluxes are really seasonal. This is the planet breathing. This is photosynthesis happening in the spring, and I guess you call it the fall. We call it the autumn. That's when things decay and the CO2 gets emitted back. So it goes back and forth. Whereas the fossil fuel fluxes, although they do vary a bit, by comparison, they barely vary at all. But then when you average within each year, so you can kind of integrate within each year, you get the net annual flux in the bottom plot, and you see that actually they average out to similar magnitude. So there's all these different things happening at different scales, but just keep in mind this kind of time series structure, because we're going to use it to build a model later on. Now, once it's in the atmosphere, it goes into, we can represent it using mole fraction fields, which is like mole fractions like concentration, if you haven't heard that term. And that's in parts per million. And now this is a 4-dimensional field because you have space and a vertical elevation, altitude, or pressure. You can think of it as pressure levels, and time as well. So this is a snippet of that over a 3-hour period. And I've averaged it vertically because I can't really show the 3D field visually. And again, there's lots of complex structure here. You can see hotspots over China. There's a latitudinal gradient from north to south that's different in the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere, which is also quite a seasonal pattern, and so on. Now, of course, these two fields, the flux field, where the CO2 is emitted or absorbed, and the mole fraction field are related, and they're related through transport, it's called, the winds, basically, which you can write as an integral differential equation in the bottom left. You don't have to sort of, excuse me, you don't have to absorb that too deeply, but I've got some pictures that kind of show how that might work. So in the left is kind of a pulse of emissions that only occurs in roughly the continental United States. Okay, so you just emit for a month, and on the right is the response in the mole fraction field, so you can get a sense of what happens. So you can barely even see what's happening at the very first day, and then there's 2 weeks later, you can see it starting to spread around the hemisphere, and then it's only a month of emissions, so after a month, it's actually really spread around, and then in the last one is I think 6 weeks after it started, and it's really starting to spread east to west, and then over time, slowly, it takes about 3 years, it would eventually hit the South Pole and be fully mixed vertically. So there's kind of this whole process that happens that relates to fluxes and the CO2 in the atmosphere. Okay, so the goal in this project was to estimate fluxes. And broadly, it turns out that fluxes are really hard to measure meaningfully over large scales. So you can go out and put up eddy covariance towers and measure it at a specific location, but it's really hard to generalize that out to, you know, like Siberia. This entire huge region can be really influenced by local sources. So basically, you could say it's impossible to measure global flux fields directly. Like, it's basically true. So usually we do estimation indirectly, and there are two broad classes. So there are bottom-up methods which start with a mechanistic understanding and calibrated with measurements. So in that case, you might build a computer model of the ecosystem, different plant types, and run it, and see what it says about what the fluxes should be when things grow. And these are quite good. They target one type of flux, so either plant flux, or you can do this with fossil fuel usage and stuff like that. And they get you really fine spatial scales, but they're quite variable in accuracy. So if you have a problem in one of the processes that you're, if you haven't calibrated a variable correctly or something like that, then they can just be biased over huge spatial regions. So these are bottom-up methods, and instead we used other groups used a top-down method, which is called flux inversion, and see next slide. So the idea in flux inversion is you actually work backwards through this transport relationship. So you start with observations of the mole fraction field, which is actually quite easy to measure. You know, you just go out and take a parcel of air and then analyze it and work out how much CO2 was in it, or you can do it from satellites as well. That's easy to measure. Then it's hard to work backwards through this transport relationship because you have to dial back the winds back in time. It's an ill-posed inversion problem. But if you can do it, then you can get an estimate of the flux field pretty much everywhere, which is more accurate at large scales, although less accurate at fine scales. So it's like it's quite complementary to bottom-up methods. So we built a model to do this, a statistical model, and there's been lots of work on this over the years in the atmospheric sciences community, but not so much in the statistical community. So we weren't quite the first group to do it, but we were pretty early to it. And we built a method which we called Wombat. So Wombat's a very famous Australian animal, and here's a picture. It stands for the Wollongong, for us, it stands for the Wollongong methodology for Bayesian assimilation of trace gases. So hopefully you can appreciate our ability to torture the language to give us what we want out of it. And we made version 1.0 a little while ago, which has been which joined several other flux inversion systems that were being operated globally. So we've got Wollongong out there. And then later on, we've made version 2.0, and that's actually what I've been talking about, but I'm going to show you a bit more about. And the point of 2.0 was to study the changes to the fluxes. So it's really focusing on that question. So there's our wombat. Okay, so let's build a model. So first off, we had this notion of different processes that contribute to the flux. It's additive. They don't actually interact. Once they hit the flux field, they might interact physically. And so we can just model the total flux X, that plot we saw before, as a sum of component fluxes that come from different things. Okay, start there. And then here's the engine room. So for a single one of these, we assign this model. This is a spatially varying time series decomposition. It's kind of in the class of geographically weighted regression. But here's the idea. So do you have the flux at time st for a particular component, and then that'll have an intercept, which is spatially varying, and a trend, spatially varying. So different locations will just have different amounts of fluxes. Then we have this spatially and time varying seasonality. So this is just the sum of annual harmonics that let us fit all sorts of different seasonal shapes at the annual frequency. And we let this actually change over time, because it turns out that the seasonality is changing too in flux. It's not just the trend. There's not just a trend. And then finally, we have this residual term epsilon, which captures everything that's not either trend or seasonal. And usually when you do a regression, you don't care much about the residuals, but we do care, because in this case, it's anything that isn't seasonality or a trend, and there's lots of things that can do that. So if you have an El Nino event, it could cause elevated temperatures or reduced rainfall, which could lead to more plant decomposition and then more flux. So the residual is actually really interesting in this model, unlike most models. And so these betas and the epsilons in our model end up being unknown. If we estimate these, then we've estimated the flux. It sort of all adds up. So that's what we do. But what's good about this structure is these different betas have an interpretation. So beta 1 is the trend. So if you see this as positive, it suggests that the CO2 flux is increasing at that location over time, and so on. How am I doing for time? Okay. Yeah. Okay. All right. So that's the flux model. Now we need to relate it to observations. So we have to go through transport. So flux is, at a location, you emit some CO2, but then it's a loft and it moves around. So when you observe CO2, it wasn't necessarily emitted where you observe it. You have to work backwards. So I showed the relationship before, this integral differential equation, but we can't compute that exactly. We don't know the true winds. We can't do it. So we use an approximation G hat, which is in the form of a chemical transport model that atmospheric scientists write, which is why we need those as collaborators, among many other reasons. And so we run that, but of course, once you use an approximate transport model, you have error. So as statisticians, it's really important always that if you add up everything, you get back the truth. So we have to put an error term in, okay? Because we know it's not real. So there we go. So V, we have this in V, or nu, I think it is actually, which is our error term. Okay, so at least we have a model. It might not be very good. And then we have observations, and observations come with noise. So you still can't observe this thing exactly. And they might even be biased in the case of satellite observations. And so now we have an observational model, which is shown at the bottom. Okay, so what can you do with this? It actually almost seems overwhelming. This integral differential equation, how can you use it? It turns out that because the integral differential equation is linear, you can use it. So I don't have time to go into this too deeply, but we applied a low rank basis decomposition on these betas and these epsilons. So if you know what that means, you know what that means. If you don't, it doesn't really matter. It just reduces the dimensionality of our problem to like 10,000 unknown variables instead of an infinite field. Okay. And then it turns out that because integrals like the ones shown here are actually linear in some sense. So if you vary the flux field linearly, there's a linear response in the mole fraction field. Now, this wouldn't be true, by the way, if CO2 had significant chemical reactions in the atmosphere. It just turns out it doesn't. So it turns out it's pretty linear. So what it means basically is that if you output one molecule of flux, or CO2 rather, and then two molecules, those two molecules can be expected on average to follow the same path as the first one. So you get the same response if you double the flux. It's actually really useful property. You just get double the response. So it turns out you can actually linearize this into a linear model. And it's not actually a really bad linearization, not a Taylor approximation. It really is linear. And then we kind of know what to do with these models as statisticians. We have methods to solve it. A little bit more complicated because we have a constrained Gaussian, but we can do it. And then we have further parameters that govern the hierarchical. It's a hierarchical model. We have some unknown parameters that govern like how the fluxes work, their autocorrelation in time and stuff like that. Don't have time to talk about it, but we have those. We put a prior on it, and we kind of know what to do. So we did it. We got some results. We estimated the fluxes for a 6-year period from 2015 to 2020 using data that were available. I'll talk about those in a second. We did inference using Markov chain Monte Carlo. So it's kind of hard, but you can get it to go. It's pretty standard. And we had data from two sources. We had in situ data. So in situ data is pretty similar to what Killian was talking about, where you go out and you just like take a sample of air, or you have a continuous analyzer. And so Mauna Loa is a place where this has been done for a really long time in Hawaii. So it's a picture of Mauna Loa. And then on the top right, I have a plot of where all these in situ stations are. And you can see that they're pretty dense in Europe and North America and pretty sparse everywhere else. So they're really good. They give really high quality, unbiased data where you have them, but you don't have them everywhere. So NASA in 2014 launched the satellite orbiting Carbon Observatory 2, which has CO2 in the name. Fantastic. It wasn't meant to. It was meant to be orbiting carbon just OCO. And that one exploded on launch, and they launched the second one and called it OCO2, and they got a better name for $400 million. Anyway, that's a satellite which is up there, and it gets retrievals of CO2, but they're not as good. They're less accurate. They can be biased, but they have really good coverage. So these two sources are kind of complementary. So we use them. And okay, I'll just talk. I'm nearly done, so I'll just talk about some results. So what you can do is you can integrate over the flux field and talk about the global flux. So what's the net amount of CO2 that was emitted last year or in any given time? And this is just looking at the trend component of that global flux. And so we find that both land and ocean are still increasing their absorption, which means that they're going more negative. So negative flux means from atmosphere to land, to surface. So this is good. It's expected, but it's reassuring. And it's kind of amazing that we can see this in a 6-year time period. You know, you'd expect it to be slow enough that you have to get longer, but it turns out we can see it. And then in our model, we can ask the question, so where we know that land ecosystems are increasing their uptake on net, but you can ask which ecosystems are doing it. And it pops out in our model that it looks like it's in the tropics. The tropics are absorbing more CO2 over time. It's not just that they absorb CO2 full stop, but they're absorbing more over time, which is good to know, because we should probably look after the tropics then. But outside of the tropics, sometimes we see some red, which means they're actually more emission happening. We can also ask questions. So if you remember, we had a seasonal cycle that could vary over time. So we can ask questions like, is the amplitude of the seasonal cycle changing? And there have been previous work. So this paper, Graven et al., they actually looked at time series seasonal cycles from measured in the 50s and compared to seasonal cycles measured recently, and found that the amplitude of the seasonal cycle had increased. But to our surprise, you can actually see that in the 6-year observational record. I mean, that was a 50-year difference, and they could see it. And so we actually see here that each line is a different year's seasonal cycle, and you can see it's getting sort of deeper. And this could be, there's lots of reasons why. It could be due to forests getting younger or increased temperatures. And I don't actually understand all the plant phenology that goes into it, but there's some reason why this could be expected, but it's good to see it. And again, we can ask where, like which areas are increasing in amplitude. And the answer turns out to be actually almost everywhere. The seasonal cycle is increasing in amplitude, but most strongly in the Northern Hemisphere. Now that maybe isn't surprising, because that's where most of the forests are. So we would expect to see a response, the larger response would be in those ecosystems. But again, we can sort of ask this question, you know, what's the 6-year amplitude change in all these things? And so there were lots of actually other changes that we looked at. We looked at phase changes in our paper, but kind of in the interest of time, I've left that out too. But we do see ecosystems changing phase. And it's probably time for me to wrap up. So I'll just conclude and say, the carbon cycle is changing rapidly in response to human influences, and we need to quantify that. This is one way. And I'll mention that our estimates have been involved in a global stocktake of CO2 sources and sinks organised by the UN as part of the Paris Agreement. So we're really proud and excited to have that happen. Actually, we went in with some other groups with that. Kind of inspirationally, the fusion of statistical methods with atmospheric science can help answer these questions. And I'll just mention, yeah, so we've got a paper, this will appear in the Annals of Applied Statistics soon. And if you want to read it in the meantime, you can go and archive and there's the paper. And that's all I've got. So thank you.
If anyone has questions, Michael, let's sort of find the good slides loaded for our next two speakers. So we can start working on that. I'll start. You were doing harmonics.
Yeah.
As part of your company.
Three.
So which ones did you choose and why?
Oh, well, only annual harmonics.
Right.
Three
I saw the 365.
multiples of the annual harmonic.
So it was like one and then a half year and then a third year?
Yeah, that's right. And it turns out that was enough. There's lots of things I didn't talk about, but we did have bottom-up estimates to compare to.
Okay.
And so that was enough to pretty much grab any seasonal structure we saw in the bottom-up estimates.
Oh, perfect. Okay. Yeah, that was my question. Anyone else? Question? Yeah, from
Yeah, I'm just curious about the idea of books. I've never seen it in like environmental. I'm just curious, was it the environmental or the atmospheric scientists that came up with that idea, or was it statisticians, or was it a mixture of both? Like in your team kind of.
We said fluctuating the concept of fluctuating as achieving by working backwards from the atmospheric observations. That's actually a pretty old idea. So people have been doing that since, I think the first papers that I know about were in the 80s. So once computers were capable of forward simulating the atmosphere, the notion came up that you could work backwards from that to work backwards. So definitely not statisticians.